The nations have been part of the British story since the Raj and the days of empire. But now mission is from everywhere to everywhere. This setting could be where you are. Britain is now a multicultural society. Welcome to the Friendship First course. We're really glad that you could join us. In Interserve, we're aware of the growing concern among British Christians about Islam, and we want to help ordinary Christians in the UK to respond well to Muslim people around them. Now, this is not a comprehensive course, so though it touches on topics such as Islam as a religion, its history, cultures, and contemporary issues, the main focus is on Muslims as people, and especially on how to understand them better, how to make friends and to share with them the greatest gift, which is Jesus himself. So the overall aim is to equip you with vision, confidence, skills and resources so you can make friends with Muslim people and begin the adventure of sharing Christ with them. But first of all, we start with attitude and feelings. How does this make you feel?
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول
So what emotions, memories or ideas did that clip stir up in you? Some people feel afraid or sad, while others feel curious about the words. What do they mean? Still others think of a time that they heard this sort of thing on holiday, perhaps in a Muslim country. But when I hear the call to prayer, it takes me back to the time I lived in the Middle East. I find it a beautiful art form, and I feel reassured about the many sincere Muslims. And then it provokes in me a longing for them to know God. But however you felt when viewing that clip, our prayer is that you come away from the course with a positive attitude towards your Muslim neighbours, and that you're enabled to believe for them to know God through Jesus. In a moment, you'll have an opportunity to discuss your expectations for the course with your group. Perhaps you're here because you don't know how to talk to Muslim work colleagues, or perhaps you have a Muslim friend or neighbour, but you need help with sharing the gospel in an appropriate way. The course is based on my manual, Friendship First. Each of the 6 sessions is broken up into bite-sized film clips. These are interspersed with group interaction and discussion. We see talks filmed at a Friendship First course in Oxford. So join me now as we learn more from Tim Green, who with his wife Rachel has been involved for many years in friendship and witness among Muslim people, both in the Muslim world and the UK. Now, as course leader, Tim will be speaking several times during the course, along with other experienced speakers. We'll also be hearing from those who were Muslims themselves, but are now following Jesus. They are able to speak to us from an inside perspective. But do remember, you don't have to be an expert in Islam to get to know ordinary Muslim people. We also learn from ordinary Christians who have got to know Muslim people in their area. They have started the adventure of friendship and witness.
Welcome to the Friendship First course, and to everyone here from different churches in Oxford. Welcome to those of you that are following this course in the DVD version and in small discussion groups in your churches, wherever you are, in home groups. Although this course is being filmed in one particular city, yet we very much hope that you'll be able to apply the lessons from it to the situation of your own city or town, wherever you're living, and to the Muslim communities you're living among. And especially as you get involved in the small group discussion in your home groups, you'll be able to see how to apply it for your own local context. Now let's begin with a startling thought. Almost a quarter of all the people on our planet are Muslim, and God loves every one of them. Have you ever stopped to think about that? Let me say it again. Almost a quarter of all the people on our planet are Muslim, and God loves every one of them. Now, what are the implications of that statement? Well, firstly, we're not talking about any tiny, obscure sect, but almost a quarter of the world's population. That's an awful lot of people for whom Christ died. Secondly, they're Muslim. Some are conservative, some are casual, some are radical, some are almost atheist. But almost all of them didn't choose Islam. They were born into it and live under it. Thirdly, God loves every one of them. That means we must love them too. And however we feel about Islam as a religious system, Muslims are people whom God loves, and we want them to know that love through the Lord Jesus. So that's our starting point in this course. What is Islam? Islam means submission, and Muslim is the one who submits. Islam is, of course, a religion, but it's much more than a religion. Islam is about law. In fact, you could argue, as some people have, that law is the core and kernel of Islam itself. While Christianity has focused most of its debate historically on issues of theology, Islam has focused it mostly on issues of law, and there are important reasons for that. Islam's about politics, for you cannot privatize Islam. A Muslim person I met in this city once said to me, "When I go out to work, I don't want to have to hang up my faith in the cupboard." I like that phrase. It was a challenge to me as a Christian. I don't want to have to hang up my faith in the cupboard either. But how does Islam express itself publicly, politically? Islam is political. It cannot be avoided. And that, of course, is a major issue in the world today. Islam is culture. And culture is about the whole way that people live, the whole way of life that we'll be talking more about next week. And I think that part of the strength of Islam is culture, combined with social relationships, that glue, that strong glue that binds a Muslim into their community and the Muslim way of life. Which, of course, is one of the biggest reasons why it's so hard for those who leave Islam. Because what they're walking out from is not just a religion, but a community, a close social network, that even if they are not choosing to leave it, they're often driven out from it. And that's a very painful thing. Islam is a secure way of life, from the cradle to the grave. You hear the words of the Islamic creed whispered in your ears by your father the moment you're born. And you'll go out from this life as you're carried to the grave, again to the words of the Muslim creed and Quranic verses. So from the cradle to the grave, you are held in this secure framework, which is Islam. Islam is a whole way of life. It began, we would say, 1400 years ago. Now, Muslims would claim that it began with Adam, but historically it began with Muhammad, who was born in 570 AD, but didn't actually receive what he claimed were revelations from God until he was 40 years old. And then he continued to recite those as he received them for the remaining 22 years of his life. Now, these were words that Muslims believe were dictated by God, word from word, from a prototype in heaven in Arabic to Muhammad, who then spoke them out. People memorized them and later wrote them down, and they became the Quran that we know today. So that the only genuine Quran is the Arabic text, and any translation from it is a mere interpretation. Now, for the first part of that period, after Muhammad was 40 years old and began to preach, he was in the city of Mecca, his home city in the south of Saudi Arabia. And as he preached, a small gathering of followers gathered around him, but his preaching was unpopular because he was speaking out against idolatry and against the oppression of the poor. And these were features of life in Mecca as a center of trade. Now, that's the traditional version. Of course, like all historians, we have to say, how do we know what we think we know about the origins of Islam? And it's surprising, actually, that the Quran itself tells us remarkably little about early Islamic history. For that, we have to turn to other sources, most notably the biographies of Muhammad and the hadith, which are the traditions, huge numbers of traditions of what he said and what he did. Now, these only were collected in their final form and finally put together about 8 generations after his lifetime. And compared with the 1 generation or so that we have in the writing down of the Gospels recounting Jesus' lifetime, we see that there's quite a long historical gap. But be that as it may, these are the traditional accounts of the origins of Islam, and the hadith, in fact, are very important for Muslims around the world because they give the guidance on how Muslims should live and act, and even Muslim men should have a beard and what you should wear, and all the detail, a lot of the detail about Muslim way of life comes from them. Now, Muhammad was preaching in Mecca, but his small group of followers was getting persecuted, and the great turning point in the history of Islam, and in fact the date from which the Muslim calendar comes, is called the year of the Hijrah. Now, the Hijrah means the migration of Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to Medina, a city which, in contrast to Mecca, welcomed him and allowed him to establish the world's first Islamic state. In other words, the first place in the world where Islam could express itself not just as a religion, but also as a political system and a whole way of life that got established and had territory, and with Muhammad as both the political and the religious ruler of that city. So he had a great triumphal entry, we could say, into the city of Medina in the year 622. And we note in passing that Jesus too had a triumphal entry of a very different kind. He too had the opportunity to take political power, which is what the crowds wanted him to do. He turned his back on that opportunity, and he ended up in a position of weakness, indeed strung up on the cross only a few days later. And so the DNA of Christianity and the DNA of Islam are very different in the sense that their origins and their period of development for the first 300 years were so different. One in a position of power, assuming power, and one in a position of weakness. Well, anyway, Muhammad, after consolidating his power in Medina, came back with a much larger army 8 years later, conquered Mecca, cleansed and cleared out the idols from the Kaaba, and he said this is now going to be the place to which Muslims from around the world will point for saying the prayers. And so although he died only 2 years after that. Yet Islam was already starting to spread and continued to spread with extraordinary speed, so that by the year 711 AD, which is only 80 years after Muhammad's death, the Muslim empire stretched from Gibraltar in the west to Pakistan in the east. Now, it doesn't mean that all people in that area immediately became Muslims, still less did they do so at the point of the sword, although there were occasional instances of that. Much more typically was a gradual Islamization of cultures, so with a trickle-down effect. The other religions that were allowed to continue under Islam, slowly people saw the advantages of turning to Islam. And gradually the proportion of conversion to Islam increased over the centuries, so that now the whole of that area that I've just talked about is predominantly, and in some cases almost exclusively, Muslim, although in some parts of it there are still ancient Christian communities, places like Egypt, for instance, that continue to maintain their Christian identity. So Islam in those areas where it had control spread through a top-down approach. But there were other areas beyond Islam's territory where you see a bottom-up approach. And those were places where Muslim traders and Sufi saints spread the influence of Islam. And gradually people turned to Islam, and you get a percolating up effect that came. And indeed, of course, now Muslims are spread in most parts of the world. Now, finally, just a few words about beliefs and practices of Islam. I haven't actually started there because you probably know something of those already, and you'll learn more about them from the exercise we're going to do shortly. The main purpose of this course isn't to fill your head with a whole lot of knowledge about Islam. It is to help you to get to know Muslims as people and to build friendships and witness with them. However, let's listen to a very brief explanation of the 5 pillars of Islam, the 5 basic practices, which we'll hear now from a Muslim leader himself.
The 5 pillars of Islam are that one should believe in oneness of God, that Allah, which is Arabic name of God, which God is one. And Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the last messenger and last prophet of God. That is the first pillar. The second pillar of Islam is to perform 5 times daily prayer, that is every day on his set prescribed times, 5 times a day, to perform the 5 times daily prayer. The third pillar of Islam is to fast the 30 days in the month of Ramadan, that is the Islamic month, that Muslims throughout the world, they fast 30 days once in a year of the holy month. Fourth pillar is that to pay the post due, that is a tax on every Muslim who has reached age of puberty and has got wealth that has been with him for 1 year, and if he has £100 in his savings, which is excessive, then he pays 2.5% of that once in a year. That is called zakat. And the fifth pillar, finally, is the pilgrimage to the house of God, that is in Mecca, once in his lifetime, and that is if a person has got means of wealth.
Now, that was very brief, so let me just add a few more comments on those, and particularly on the ones which are most obvious, because some of them, like the Hajj pilgrimage, and you'll see some footage of that going on in the background, happen just once in a lifetime, and that's if you're fortunate. And many Muslims never get to go on the pilgrimage. Other things like paying the zakat once a year for the helping the poor. Again, you don't necessarily see the Muslim person doing that, nor will you necessarily hear them reciting the creed. But what you will see them doing is praying. The 5 daily prayers of Islam are a kind of ritual prayer, a liturgy, a set liturgy in Arabic language, with set motions to go with it. And that happens at set times during the day. It sort of punctuates and gives a rhythm to the daily routine of a sincere Muslim person. Not everybody, of course, does it, but those that want to really mark religious observance as much as anything by seeking to be as regular as they can with the 5 daily prayers. And so this forms a sort of a pattern to life that is quite impressive, particularly when you are living in a Muslim country and you hear the call to prayer. The first one goes off before dawn. It's very early in the morning. You roll over in bed. You hear the call to prayer from the minaret, and you know that Muslims are going off at this early hour to go and say their prayers. There's a different form of prayer, which is your personal requests to God, and that's called dua. You can do that in your own mother tongue. But the ritual prayer, salat, has to be done in the set way in Arabic. And then the other thing that you'll see Muslims do once a year, and this sets a pattern to the year just as the prayer sets a pattern to the day, is the fasting, the month of fasting in Ramadan. And again, it's an impressive thing. I remember when I first became aware of how tough it is was when I was working in a factory in the middle of summer in the north of England, where the daylight lasted about 19 hours a day. And for 12 of those hours, my Muslim colleagues were working in a very hot, smoky environment without a drop to eat or drink. And for the whole 19 hours, they were going without. And I realized, because I tried it myself for a few days, just how tough it was. So I do respect them for that. But of course, the great compensation is that you have wonderful feasts in the evening. And then at the end of the month, you have a great feast called Eid, where everybody has new clothes and presents and lots of food. That sets the pattern of the year, just as the daily prayers set the pattern on a daily basis. So did you grow up in a sort of strongly practicing Muslim family?
Yes, I felt I was very privileged to having been born in a Muslim family, and I was brought up as a Muslim. I grew up in with a Muslim community, Muslim Islamic Brotherhood, and I never felt that there is anything else that I could compare to than being a Muslim. In fact, I remember one time I used to lead prayers, and I would say, Rabbana al-Maut al-Muslimin, and I would say this word, and tears come out of my eyes, just asking God to help me die when I'm a Muslim.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about Islam being a secure framework from the cradle to the grave, something you're born into, you remain in, you die in. What we're trying to do is to get inside, not just sort of read about, here's a list of 5 pillars, anyone can do that from a book, but to get inside what it's like. So what's it like to get up early in the morning? Did you, from a young age, practice the prayers regularly? Tell me about your experience of what it's like to be praying the prayers.
Well, I would say my recollections are when I was 8 years old, and then that I remember my father coming up in the morning with water, cold water, pouring it on me, saying, wake up, wake up, wake up, it's time to pray. And sometimes I would hide under the bed, not wanting to go for prayer, and sometimes thinking, where is he gone? And my sister would lie for me, saying, oh, he's gone to the mosque. And so at the age of 8, so you can see it's not very serious.
Yeah.
To some people. It's still very important, but waking up in the morning is a very difficult commitment. So until I started understanding the reasons why I was praying as a Muslim, and why I had to go to the mosque, and why God had chosen Islam for me, and what the Quran meant for me as a Muslim. And also I also started knowing that actually focusing on God, remembering God, is a reward for everyone who commits their lives to Islam and pray 5 times a day. And I also realized that it's a requirement for everyone to do. It's a duty. It's not even just something that you just choose to do. It's a duty you have to do, but you also have to do it. So until I realized that, the significance of prayer, 5-day prayer, became very important. And so at about probably 14, something like that, I was very passionate about praying, and I would wake up. My father superseded me in the way he prayed, because he would wake up at 3 a.m. every single day and pray. And then after that, he would go back to sleep, and then he would wake up at 6 or 5 and then pray again, the required prayer.
So the first one was even extra to the
Yeah,
to the
even
5
extra
ones, right?
to the 5 one.
Yeah.
5 required
So,
prayers.
so you became regular and committed in your prayers,
Yeah.
like 5 times a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. It became part of your life, did it? Yeah.
It becomes, well, fast is a duty, as
Yeah.
I said. It's a duty you have to fulfill. You can't, you will, in Islam, you will have your, God will judge you and they will look at you and the prayers that you've made. And if you have, every prayer that I would pray takes away my sins. So every time I go and make a prayer, if I pray 5 times, they are all very well designed. You pray 6 o'clock, you pray 1 o'clock, you pray 4 o'clock, you pray 6 o'clock, and you pray before you go to sleep. And it's very unlikely for you that you're going to sin before you go to bed.
Yeah.
So all these prayers take away your sins,
Yeah.
and God forgives you in those times every time you go. So every time you come out of that prayer, you are clean, and you have no, you are considered to have no sin at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was very committed to that, and I was very passionate for that, and I had confidence. I felt that in those, when I was growing up, that it's such a privilege to be a Muslim.
And okay, so that's prayers. What about the fasting? We've heard that's another pillar of Islam. Fasting in Ramadan, was that a burden for you, or was that also a privilege?
Fasting. Actually, there is one element that I can think of when I was growing that is about fasting, which is that when you're fasting, you know that everyone else is fasting. So it's very difficult to say, I can't fast. It's actually easier to not go for 5-day prayer than it is not to fast, because it's more you are involved as a community, as a Muslim community. It's a reward. It's when I fasted Ramadan, I felt like I can't even describe how I really would feel as a Muslim, but I felt like I was closer to God, I was coming closer to God, and I wanted to come closer to God during that time. And so I would do extra to see, even, my father, I told you, he would pray every morning at 3 a.m. So during the Ramadan, when I would fast, then it would mean I would have to wake up with my dad voluntarily to make sure that I get more reward from God for doing what I was doing.
Yeah, so you gained reward from your prayers, you gained reward from the fasting. Yeah. Now, what about memorizing the Quran? Did you get reward from that? And what age were you when you started to memorize bits of the Quran in Arabic?
Well, when I was about 5, as far as I can remember, really, but I think, to not exaggerate, I was about 5. Yeah. 5 years old. And I remember I would wake up with my dad, and he would read us the Quran, and we would repeat after him before we could read properly, and he would just sit down and we would repeat the words with my dad, what he says, and he would then interpret them for us if we needed some interpretation, and so I grew up knowing these Quranic words. And then after that, I went to school, and it was a Muslim school, and then even there I was taught the Quran, and I recited the Quran, and I started memorizing parts of the Quran. And about the age of 14, when I became very much aware of what I was doing, the Quran became really part of me. And so I would recite it, I would read it, I would try to understand what it says, and with the meaning of it. So
you recite it in Arabic?
Yes.
But that's not your mother tongue, so
no.
You then translate for the understanding.
Yeah.
So did you memorize the whole Quran?
I was about 17 when it's like a graduation party.
Yeah.
And I completed the whole of the Quran.
Yeah.
And the whole of the Quran was in my head.
Can you recite some of it now for us?
In fact, I was about to bring my Quran. I was thinking, I forgot it. I'm always
Don't worry, it's in your head.
But it's in my head.
Go on then.
So I will recite it. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alif Lam Mim. ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون أولئك على هدى من ربهم وأولئك هم المفلحون.
And so on and so on and so on for 114 chapters. That's
Actually,
pretty amazing.
This is the longest chapter.
Well, later in our course, we're going to be learning a bit more about the Quran and especially, what it says about Jesus and so on. So anyway, you memorized the Quran and you then went for training and studied at the foremost university of Islamic learning in the world, which is the Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which is older than Oxford University, and graduated from there, and thereby was qualified to be an imam, and came back to Uganda as an imam of his local mosque. And what was your desire at that time? You were an imam. Were you kind of seeking to spread Islam? What was your
Yes. When I went back after graduating in Islamic law, I wanted to have more people come to Islam. There is the Quran, the Hadith tells me, and the Quran also tells me there is no great job anyone can have other than actually to invite people to Islam. So I was very keen to bring many people to Islam, to enter Islam. The Quran tells me, "Inna dina inda Allah Islam." The religion God has chosen for all of us is Islam, and there is no way one can go to Allah without Islam. And Christianity seemed very much more of something people do because it's easy, rather than actually serious about God. And they seemed to be. And the Quran it says actually that the Christian religion changes to their own desires. The Quran says about Christianity.
So
I felt
it would never have crossed your mind ever to become a Christian
I would
yourself?
never want to be a Christian because I thought I'm in the best religion.
Yeah.
And as an imam, I felt that every Muslim should be calling at everyone to come to Islam. And it's just never occurred to me that anyone in his right mind would actually leave Islam or would think that Islam is not the way for us as
So
humans.
you're still a Muslim now?
What do you think?
We'll find out after the break. Thank you, that is absolutely fantastic. That's great. Brilliant. Now, events in the Muslim world are ever changing, and our window on that world is mostly through the media, which of course is essential and welcome, and the media sometimes gives us kind of accurate and helpful portrayals of what's happening in the Muslim world. Sometimes it gives us distorted ones. Wherever we pick up our ideas, the fact is that there are misconceptions, of which three common ones I want to talk about now. These are, one, the misconception that most Muslims are Arabs. Second, that most Muslims are terrorists. And third, that no Muslim can turn to Christ. Most Muslims are Arabs. Actually, you'll be surprised to know that less than 1 in 5 of all the Muslim people in the world are Arabs. Another 1 in 5 are in sub-Saharan Africa, and almost all the rest are Asian. So in other words, about 60% of the world's Muslim population is Asian. So your demographically average Muslim in the world today is not wealthy, elderly, and Arab, but young, Asian, and poor. Here's a graph of the most populous Muslim countries, i.e. the Muslim countries with the largest Muslim populations, and they are, in order, Indonesia, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, the first 4. So in other words, those first 4, all of which have Muslim populations over 100 million, they are all in Asia. And it's only later on that we get into the Middle East, and in fact, out of those large Muslim populations, the only Arab one at all is Egypt. So people sometimes say, I want to go and reach out to my Muslim neighbors, so I must learn Arabic. I tend to disagree. Find out what the heart language is of the Muslim people around you and start learning a few phrases, at least, in their language. Many Muslims in the world don't actually speak or understand Arabic. So that's the first misconception, that most Muslims in the world are Arabs. Secondly, most Muslims are terrorists. Now, it's not surprising if that conception has grown in recent years with all the events that we've had since 9/11, the horrendous attacks on the Twin Towers in New York, as we'll all, I'm sure, remember where we were when that news broke. And all the subsequent events since then, the 7/7 bombings in London and other threats of terrorism that we're hearing about in the media all the time. And, you know, there are some Muslim terrorists. There's no point denying it. However, it's important to say 2 things in response to that. Firstly, that although this violent extremist response, killing people and especially killing innocent people, is obviously and unquestionably wrong, yet it's important also to understand some of the reasons that Muslim people have reacted, or some of them have reacted in this way. Because we see Islam as being an attack on the West, but many Muslims see the West as being threatening the world of Islam. The other thing, I think, of course, to remember is that not all Muslims are terrorists. In fact, only a small minority are. Now, there's a whole range, as you'll see in your Friendship First book, of different types of Muslims. There are those who are so convinced and so active and passionate for Islam that they will want to go out and spread it in the world, either by violence or by preaching, and try to bring the whole of the world under the control of Islam. So anyway, there are those activist Muslims, and then there are very many Muslims who are convinced of the truth of Islam, but don't necessarily want to push it on other people. And that includes many Muslims in the West and in Britain. There are also Muslims who are just traditional. In other words, Islam is part of their culture, something they've inherited. It's the way of life that we've been talking about earlier. It's their community, it's the social glue, it's all of those things that just are part of the comfortable clothes that they wear, if you like, because this is the context and the culture that they're in. It doesn't mean they're actively promoting Islam. They may not even necessarily be very serious about following every aspect of Muslim law, but they are Muslim because they're part of that culture. And then there are those that we could almost call atheist Muslims. Now, you know, is that not a contradiction in terms, to be an atheist and a Muslim? Well, in one sense it is, because to be a Muslim means believing in Islam and in Allah and Muhammad and so on. But actually, there's a lot of people, for instance, who are reading Richard Dawkins' books and have actually turned away from any real belief in God, but who still call themselves Muslim, if you like, with a small m, because it's still part of their culture, their upbringing, their community. So let's remember, not all Muslims are the same, and certainly not all Muslims are terrorists. So those are 2 misconceptions. One is that most Muslims are Arabs. One is that most Muslims are terrorists. And the third one is that no Muslim can turn to Christ. Now, again, that is a misconception that we might get because we hardly hear about it on the media. But extraordinarily, more Muslims are turning to Christ now than any time in the whole of history. And therefore, we live in an incredibly privileged generation. Now, you can point to divine reasons for this, the way that God honors sowing that was done in previous generations. I think of one missionary couple that went to North Africa about 100 or so years ago. They spent a whole generation, they saw no fruit at all among the Muslim people they served. Their son went back, his name is Charles Marsh, he's written some books, he's quite well known, He labored for a whole generation, saw a tiny bit of fruit, but almost nothing. His daughter, as an old lady, went back. Now, this is recently, in the last few years. And she joined in a church where there were hundreds of former Muslims in Algeria just praising the Lord. And she was overwhelmed by it because she could see the fruit of what her parents and grandparents had sown. Iran's another example. Amazing things are happening inside the country of Iran, partly the courageous witness, actually, of those that have been willing to die for their faith. But huge numbers are turning to Christ in Iran today, and indeed among Iranians around the world, including Britain and many places in Europe. So I think there are kind of spiritual reasons for what's happening, not least the unprecedented amount of prayer going on for Muslims around the world. But there's also human reasons. And I think one of those reasons is that in the past, if you were in a village and you were under the mosque and the minaret dominated the village and the imam told you what to believe, that was it. That controlled your worldview. And now there's hardly anywhere in the Muslim world where that applies. This is a picture taken from the block of flats where Rach and I lived in Jordan, and you can see that there is a minaret there on the skyline, but it's crowded out by a forest of TV aerials and satellite dishes. So Muslims in the world today, both in the West and in the Muslim world, are getting a choice in the religious supermarket of ideas, and the opportunity to shop around in that supermarket and to find that there are alternatives to just the traditional Islam that they've always been told. And from a human angle, this surely is one of the reasons why there are now more Muslims turning to Christ than ever before. And therefore we live in a privileged generation and with a great responsibility. So those are three misconceptions about Muslims in the world today. You were Imam of the university mosque. It was Ramadan, wasn't it? And you were fasting, and it was a Friday, and you had just said you led the prayers and given a sermon, and then what happened?
When you've recited the Quran, you want to keep it in you, so you keep reciting it. And I was reciting Quran, and as I was reciting the Quran, I heard a voice calling my name and saying, "I am Christ, I want you to follow me." And given what I told you already, you probably can guess what my reaction would be in a situation like that, because I completely despised Christianity and completely felt that it was more of degrading myself to even enter a church. So when this happened, I was very troubled and suspicious of what had come. So I asked God to stop this that has happened. I thought it was Satan who was speaking to me, because in Islam there's a very strong belief that Satan tempts you, Satan does all these things that are evil. And so I prayed to God to stop Satan. And as I was praying, the voice called me again. And to cut a very long story short, the voice called me and said exactly the same words. And I was very shocked, to say the least. I was very surprised, because as a Muslim, although I believed in God and I believed that God exists, I never expected an interaction of some sort with humans. And I also never expected, I'd never heard of anyone who had had such an experience.
So you were still in the mosque at this stage when you heard the sound?
Yes,
and
yes.
were there other people there with you?
Yeah, we yeah, there were people as a Friday finished the prayer.
The end of the
it's
prayer time,
end
the
of
people
prayer
milling
time.
around. Yeah.
People stay around to
Yeah.
hear they, read the Quran, and some even make extra prayers. So there were quite a few people around.
Was it a loud voice?
The voice was, well, what happened was that when I was in the mosque, when I heard this voice, was loud, was a bit like you could hear someone calling you from down here, from there, or from there. That was how I
All
could
around
hear.
you at the same
Yeah,
time?
yeah. The window of the mosque broke as a result of this happening. It was like for that minute or two, it was like an earthquake came and spoke and did something about the place, to the mosque. I thought I was going to die, because inside me, I thought clearly this is God. But my mind, my logic, my thinking, everything just went against what my heart was saying.
So what did you do?
And as I was debating inside, saying, what can I do? But I surely can't become a Christian. Anyway, I thought I was going to die. So I ran to this was in a university, so I ran to a small chapel in the university, which was for Christians. Christians gathered every evening. And I went wearing exactly like this. And they were wondering what I had come to do. And many people fear Muslims. This is really unbelievable, shocking. People fear Muslims so much. And I could see people moving around and not actually wanting to be with me. And I was crying, I was in tears, and I talked to the Prophet and said, how come you were to become Christians? People just prayed for me, and Christians were so excited. I remember every person gave me his Bible. I had literally about maybe 20 Bibles. And so I left the mosque, and immediately after this, my conversion was in the news, and it was very much more of a discussion. Christians were probably too excited as well, and they told other people, and other people told other people, and I lost my post immediately, and there was an emergency meeting in the Muslim. There was a lot of things. Some Muslims said I was given money to convert. Apparently, I read some interesting stories in the news about receiving a big donation from America of some sort, and some people said I had developed a medical problem, brain medical problem, and I needed a psychiatrist. Many of my family members still think, they don't actually accept that I'm a Christian, they think that I have a mental disability of some sort.
So did they reject you, your family?
Yes, they did. I was denounced from the start, because I said, I have no mental problem. I am still capable of studying. I am capable of doing everything that I was able to do. It's just that situation has happened. But my family still choose not to think that that's the case.
So just fast forwarding a little bit, they tried to persuade you initially, and
Yes.
obviously that failed, or you wouldn't
Yes.
be standing here now.
Yes.
And then did they ultimately then say, okay, enough's enough, and then kick you out?
Then it was made clear that anyone who sees me must bring me to the for the punishment Islamic court for a judgment to be decided on what is going to happen to me. And according to Islamic law anyway, it's death penalty.
Death penalty for those that leave Islam and don't return, yeah.
And I started running away, slept on the street, and but I was probably the best time for me as a Christian, because I was so dependent on God. I was so much thinking, any time from now I will meet my God. And so my prayers were so different, and my my life as a Christian was very, very different. Many Christians were very helpful and supportive, and some weren't. Some were very scared. I remember I had one time when clearly Muslims had made it's a bit like a checkmate, if you like, saying, now we've got you. And one Christian brother hid me, and he risked his life to do that. And that was incredible. But to be honest, I got beaten. I was left in a very difficult situations. But actually, during all that time, that is the time I actually knew more about the Bible, about what it means to follow Jesus. I would ask God questions about what it means, for example, Jesus to be the Son of God, those very big questions. And I would have a dream, someone explaining to me, reading with me the Bible during all that period. It was amazing. I call it my honeymoon as a Christian. It is very important to, when Muslims come to Christ, that they lose a lot, but it's very important, the person who looks at them, to know that we all have to lose a lot to follow Christ.
Yeah.
And if we know that, then we can help others. I was talking to one brother from the Middle East who has come to Christ, and I was telling him, some Christians telling him, oh, what are you going to do? Where can you run? And how can you escape? Are you going to go back home? What's going to happen? And he was like, I have got the best thing. What else do I want?
There are big challenges about Islam in the world today that can't be ignored and shouldn't be ignored. So the question is, how do we reconcile a love for Muslims with what's going on in the name of Islam? Now, I think what we need to be doing is to respond to Islam as a religious system, with all that includes in terms of ideology, accepting that there's a whole mix of different kinds of Islams that we'll be talking about next week, but to relate to Muslims as people. And if we can keep the balance of those things in our mind, then that helps us accept that we're not fighting against human beings, as the Good News version puts it for Ephesians 6, verse 12, but against spiritual forces, rulers, authorities, and cosmic powers of this dark age. Now, there are things that I respect in Islam. There are also things that I know that in Islam bind people. And so Muslims are people that are actually under that bondage. People whose eyes need opening to see the light of the glory of the gospel of Christ. And therefore, when we look at Muslims, who are we looking at and how are we seeing them? For Muslims are people. Now, Rachel and I have lived among Muslims for most of our married life. We found them on the whole to be friendly people, hospitable people, generous people, cute people, hurting people, worried people, with the same kind of anxieties that we all face about money and health and kids. Sinful people. Some are devout and some aren't. Some are zealous for Islam, others aren't. There's a mix of good and bad, made in God's image but fallen, like all of us. And so Brother Andrew of Open Doors spells Islam this way. I sincerely love all Muslims. And I think that's the thing that we have to hold on to as we look at what's happening in the world today in the name of Islam. So, are Muslims our friends or enemies? These are the questions that are getting asked. Right across Europe at the moment, there's an anti-Islamic feeling rising. Well, as Christians, if they're our friends, we should love them. And if they're our enemies, we should still love them. So do we have any choice? If we're following the way of Jesus, we don't actually have a choice. So when you see a Muslim, what do you see? A terrorist in the making? When God sees a Muslim, what does he see? A precious child. So let's end this evening just reminding ourselves of God's heart for Muslim people, because we need to align our hearts with his. And that's one of my biggest prayers for this course, that our hearts may be aligned with God's heart for 1/4 of humanity, which is under Islam.
Well, I hope this week that you've learned not only some facts about Islam, but also that you have had a chance to think about your attitude and feelings towards people who are from Muslim backgrounds. So to consolidate what you learn, each week there's a practical task and some reading for you to do. The tasks are designed to help you gain knowledge and confidence by applying what you're learning. The readings will reinforce what you've learned, as well as giving you some additional material which will supplement the teaching. So for the reading, I'd like you to read pages 26 to 28 in your Friendship First manual. And the topic, why do Muslims follow Islam? For your practical task, simply say good morning to a Muslim in your area. If you don't have a Muslim friend or contact, how about asking God each day this week to give you one? We found that he delights to answer that prayer. Well, I hope you enjoyed this week's task and that it starts to open your heart to the people of the Muslim community near you. Also, that it enables you to see Muslim people not as terrorists or enemies, but as people whom God uniquely loves. So until next time, ma salama. Bye for now.